This is Anarchast.
Welcome to Anarchast. I'm super excited to have Walter Block with us today. He's been called by Lou Rockwell Mr. Libertarian. He's the Endowed Chair in Economics at the Loyola University in New Orleans. He's also the senior faculty member of the Ludwig von Mises Institute for Austrian Economics. And he's the author of Defending the Undefendable. How are you doing, Walter?
Pretty good, thanks, Jeff, for having me on your show.
Oh, it's our pleasure, Mr. Libertarian. Of course, we have to have you on our show.
Well, I have to correct you and Lou. I think there's only one Mr. Libertarian, and it's not me, it's Murray Rothbard, but I'm just delighted to be mentioned in the same breath as him.
Well, that's your mentor, isn't it?
Yes.
So yeah, that must be very nice. I know how that feels. I've had similar things in my life where that's happened, and it's always very humbling when you get called. But you really are. You're the torchbearer at the moment. You've been writing for decades now about all this sort of stuff, the kind of things that we talk about here on Anarchast all the time, and so it's a real pleasure to have you on. So how's things going today? You busy over there at the university?
Oh, busy, yes. Writing, teaching, doing a little public speaking, yes.
It never ends, does it?
Right.
Yeah, well, the first thing I just want to ask you, it's the same thing I ask everyone because it's always an interesting story, is just how you got into libertarianism, anarchism. Were you born that way, or did you have to learn it?
Well, I was born Jewish, and I lived in Brooklyn, and that pretty much means everyone around me was a socialist, and so was I. Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College to lecture, and I came to boo and hiss her because she was evil, because she favored capitalism. And I booed and hissed her all I could, and then they had this lunch in her honor, and they said anyone could come to the lunch, even if you disagreed, and I wanted to get her more because I hadn't had enough booing and hissing at her. And the lunch was a long, long table, maybe 50 people on a side, about 100 people, and she was sitting at the head of the table, and I was relegated to the foot of the table, about 100 yards away, or maybe 50 yards away, I'm not sure. And I turned to my neighbor and I said, what's this capitalist stuff? It's no good. It's, greed and, starving kids in the street. And he said, well, I don't really know, but the people who do are at the other end of the table. So I went there and I stuck my head between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden's. And I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone about socialism and capitalism. And they said, who is it? And I said, it's me. And Brandon was very generous and gracious. And he said, I'll come to the other end of the table where there's room to speak. And on two conditions. One, you don't let the conversation lapse with this one discussion. You continue it until we resolve it, and I promised. And the other is you read two books that I'm going to recommend, and I promised that. And the two books were Atlas Shrugged and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Well, after I read those two books, and I had maybe 4 or 5 discussions with him in his apartment and in Ayn Rand's apartment with her, and I think Alan Greenspan was there and a few others, Peikoff. I was converted to, I guess, not objectivism, but to at least libertarianism. I didn't really go for objectivism. It seemed very cultish to me. And I only agreed with the economics and the politics. I couldn't understand or comprehend their metaphysics, epistemology, and all that stuff. And I wasn't interested in it. Then, to make a long story short, I met Murray Rothbard about a year or two later. And in about 5 seconds, well, it's probably 5 minutes, he converted me to anarchism. He sort of used the same argument from Henry Hazlitt that I had been using on leftists to convert them to, privatizing the post office or privatizing anything that the government does because of inefficiency and immorality. And then I was an anarchist, and this was maybe 1965. I think I met Ayn Rand in 1962 or 1963. And then I was an anarchist after having met Murray, and ever since I've been a follower of his. He's been my mentor and my friend, and I'm just privileged to have met him.
That's quite the story. It's always interesting to hear how people are. It's funny you came up and said you're a socialist and how quickly that all turned around. As a person who's doing the same myself, trying to wake people up and trying to get people to actually listen to what we're talking about here, because we're not crazy, or I don't think we're crazy. Almost always, and this is I just always laugh at. It's hard for me to even keep a straight face whenever I talk to someone. I'm trying to just tell them about free markets and how we don't need the government to do everything. They always bring up one thing. It's almost always this one thing, and it's actually like one of the easiest and simplest things to talk about. But they always go, well, what about the roads? And I always just, oh my God, are you that brainwashed and enslaved that you can't even figure out how a road would exist without the government? But that's actually the case. And you've written an excellent book called The Privatization of Roads and Highways, Human and Economic Factors. And I'm really thankful for that book, because that's who I always forward people. I always send it to them or send them a link to it and say, listen, just read this book. It's pretty basic. But can you give it? Let's say someone came up to you and then they asked you that question. Well, how would we have roads without the government? What would be your response to them in a few minutes or less?
Well, I would first of all say read this book. And you don't have to buy it because it's available for free on the web. And I would say that the first roads were private roads. The first roads in this country, in the U.S., were turnpike roads, where somebody would get up on his hind legs and make a road from here to there and charge a fee. And they would charge based on how many horses and how many axles your wagon was. They would even charge on the width of the wheel. If the wheel was wide, they would charge less, because you sort of got rid of the ruts in the road. And if the wheel was very thin, think ice skates, they would charge more because you would put ruts in the road. It was a viable operation, and the government shut it down. People have this fear that long, thin things like roads, for some reason, can't be privately owned. But we have long, thin things called railroads that were privately owned. The Northern Railroad was privately owned. The BMT and the IRT in New York City were private railroads in New York City. They were privately owned. They wanted to raise their prices from a nickel to a dime. And the government said, this is outrageous. We're going to nationalize you or municipalize you. And then guess what? They raised it from a nickel to a dime. This was in the 1920s, I think. There's no reason that you can't have private roads. People would just charge a toll. Then the objection is, well, you'd have to put a penny in every time you pass someone's house. But that's ridiculous. You could have universal product codes put at the underbody of a car, and as it rode over a certain point, it would register, and then you would just pay a monthly fee or an annual fee or whatever it was. So we could have private roads, and the main impetus I have for that is some 40,000 people a year die on the roads, and people say, well, it's due to speeding and alcoholism and driver error and that, but that's not true. Those are just proximate causes. The ultimate cause is the road management. The road manager, that is the government, can't manage its way out of a paper bag. If we had competition, Road A would brag, well, we stopped drunken drivers, and MADD, Mothers Against Drunken Drivers, would have their own road and say, well, we really stopped them. We'd have competition. The reason we have pretty good wristwatches and eyeglasses and pens is because we have competition. Why shouldn't we apply the same economic and moral insight that we apply to wristwatches and pens and eyeglasses and shirts, very pedestrian things, apply it to roads too? So that would be my 2-minute answer as to why we should privatize roads and why you don't need the government to have roads.
That's a great answer, of course. And so do you see any way that we can get to privatize roads anytime in the future? And I don't just mean the odd toll highway or anything like that, but to actually really privatize the roads. Is there any path to get there, or do we have to wait until the whole nation-state sort of thing collapses?
Well, no, I think there is a way to go. First of all, we elect Ron Paul president, and as he is converting many more people to libertarianism, he would have the support. I mean, and if he got in, he'd probably have coattails that would get in congressmen. And in addition to getting rid of the Fed and getting rid of the foreign military bases and getting rid of the FDA and getting rid of the drug laws and this and that and the other, I happen to know Ron Paul. I wouldn't say I'm a bosom buddy of his, but certainly an acquaintance, and I would ask him to put me in charge of roads, and I would privatize them. And I would privatize them as fast as the guy who's put in charge of the Department of Education or the Agriculture Department would privatize those things. I think Ron Paul would be very open to this sort of idea. It fits in with his philosophy. He hasn't mentioned this. He talks about the Fed and getting rid of various departments, but I think that if he wins, we have a good shot at getting not rid of the government entirely, because Ron is not an anarchist, but certainly privatizing roads would be a possibility.
Well, that'd be fantastic. And where are you? What do you think the odds are that Ron Paul gets elected as president?
Well, I think he's got a shot at it. I think he's not the odds-on favorite. I think Mitt Romney is the favorite. But I think what's going to happen is that Ron Paul's got staying power because his 10, 12, 15% of the Republican electorate is solid. They're not leaving him. Whereas all the other guys, they keep switching around. This guy steps on his tongue, they stop. Michelle Bachmann was front runner for a while, but then she got in trouble, and Perry was also leading the pack. I think the reason it's going to go down to Ron and Mitt Romney is because Mitt Romney looks presidential. I mean, he's tall, he's good looking, he wears a good suit, whatever, and he never says anything to offend anyone. Keeps changing his views to meet the views of the day. So I think it's going to come down to Mitt Romney and Ron Paul, and then hopefully the Republicans will realize that Mitt Romney is a Democrat. I mean, he had Romney Care in Massachusetts. He switches around on abortion. He switches around on everything. You can't trust him to say anything. And hopefully Ron will win. And then I think it'll be easy for him to beat Obama because Obama's support is going to dissipate. I mean, he's an assassin, Obama, killing an American citizen, a lackey, without any trial. I mean, that goes against the Fifth Amendment. And I think a lot of his leftist support was hoping that he'd be anti-war. I mean, he won the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, after he was in office for about a month. You ought to give that Peace Prize back. So I think that if Ron can just win the Republican nomination, he's going to kick Obama's butt, and he'll be the next president of the United States. And, some people say, well, you're an anarchist. How can you support this? Well, Ron Paul is not an anarchist, but he's a free enterpriser. He's a very, very limited government person, and all anarchism is reducing government more and more. They say that government is best which governs least, and we would say that government is best which governs not at all. Well, least and not at all are a lot closer than what we've got now.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the debate going on in the anarchist community at the moment is, do we or do we not support Ron Paul? And I know you wrote an article sort of criticizing another person who we've had on the show, Stefan Molyneux, because he was saying he doesn't support Ron Paul because he doesn't support the political process. So you're on the anarchist side, that you'll get involved in the political process if you have to in order to make freedom happen. Is that a good way to put it?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with the political process. The political process doesn't violate the libertarian anarchist axiom of non-aggression. All you do is look, if there was a slave master and he said, look, I'm giving you a choice between Overseer A, who will whip you half to death, and Overseer B, who's a nice guy, and the slaves voted for Overseer B, I don't think that they're supporting slavery. I think that this is nonsense. People criticize me for my criticism of Molyneux because I refused to listen to his reason, and I just sort of criticized him. And my answer is, well, if you come out in favor of flat Earth or in favor of Nazis being libertarians, I don't have to listen. I just know you're wrong. But I have agreed to debate Molyneux in a more formal way, so we'll see what happens on that. But I think he's just totally out to lunch on this. Look, Lysander Spooner was perhaps the best libertarian anarchist of a previous generation, and he wrote this thing about the Constitution of no authority, and he said that voting is a defensive act, just as paying taxes. Look, we all pay taxes. I don't see voting as a violation of the non-aggression axiom. If I vote for Ron Paul and Ron Paul reduces 90% of the government, well, then we'll just try to get rid of the other 10%. But, reducing 90% of the government is pretty good from an anarchist point of view. And people who say, well, no, we shouldn't do it, I think are anarchists with their head in the sand, like, who are those birds that have their heads in the sand?
Ostriches, isn't it?
Ostriches, yeah.
I think that's actually an urban myth, though, but or why they put their heads in the sand. Anyway,
I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that anarchists who voted or against Ron Paul are like ostriches, or whether it's true or not, but like the myth anyway.
Well, it's really great to get your point of view on it, because I've sort of been flip-flopping on it, I have to admit. at first I liked Ron Paul. Well, I always like Ron Paul. I like what he's saying, of course, but I was in favor. I wanted him to win, and then I skewed a little bit to what Stefan Molyneux was saying. Is I don't even want to get involved with any of this. I just, hopefully this will all just go away at some point. But now I'm sort of coming back to this side, and now the only real issue I have, or concern, is if he wins and the U.S. government all starts to fall apart at that point, because it has so much debt, they have to basically default on their debt, and that will cause huge amounts of strife, and it could easily be seen in some ways as we elected a free market guy and look what happened, everything fell apart. That's my main concern. How would you respond to that?
Well, look, there are always risks. I mean, you get out of bed, you risk, you could be hit by a bus. All I know is that Ron Paul is creating libertarians hand over fist in a way that no one else has ever done in history, with the possible exception of Ayn Rand with her magnificent books. So here Stefan Molyneux says, well, I'm an anarchist, I'm against government, and Ron Paul is creating libertarians, not anarchists, but libertarians who then can be converted into anarcho-libertarians. And he's saying, no, well, I think he's sort of a self-hating libertarian or a self-hating anarchist or something. He hasn't read Spooner. I think he's totally wrong, and he's misleading people such as yourself. I think that it's very clear that libertarian anarchists should support Ron Paul. Heck, even the left anarchists like Chomsky and Nader, who's not an anarchist, but he's a lefty, even the lefties are supporting him because of his anti-war stances. I think it's a disgrace what Stefan Molyneux is doing, and in this debate I plan on really getting on his case.
Well, I'll definitely look forward to that. In either case, you're both excellent. You're both, you know, if you have one small little difference, it's not that big of a deal, but it's kind of interesting to see, you know, and it must be interesting for you, and I know you have to go soon, but it must be interesting for you to see what's going on with the libertarian community, the anarchist community. I know decades ago it wasn't very big at all, but thanks to the internet now it's really growing, so it must be great for you to even have these sort of debates to fight over in our own factions now, because there's so many of us and so many different points of view.
Yeah, well, thank God for the internet. In the old days, it would just be the ABC, NBC, and CBS, and there'd be, I don't know, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and maybe Newsweek or LA Times, and that would be it. And Ron Paul would never be mentioned. He's still not mentioned, or they keep trying not to mention him. The Wall Street Journal had their analysis of the Republican candidates, and they mentioned 8 out of 9. I'll give you a guess as to which one they overlooked. So they're trying to freeze him out, the mainstream, the political class, our lords and masters, but because of the internet, I mean, look, this interview right now that we're doing will be shown to hundreds, thousands of people, whereas before the internet, you couldn't have got a job at the New York Times, and no New York Times reporter or CBS would interview me, because we're both nuts, you know, we favor freedom. So it's just wonderful what's going on with the internet. It's magnificent, and I'm certainly very appreciative of it.
Me too, and we're running out of time, so how can people best get your information? Is it through your website, or should they go to the Mises, or where's the best way to get more information from Walter Block?
Well, I think those two, my website and the Mises. I'm a big fan of the Mises Institute. I'm a senior fellow there, and I lecture there at the Mises University and several other around the country, the Mises circles, and I'm a big fan of the Mises Institute, Lou Rockwell. They certainly support Ron Paul, as opposed to the inside the Beltway people like Cato and Reason and all. They're sort of like Molyneux from a different point of view. I would just say read Lysander Spooner. He's an anarchist, and I'm now communing with Lysander Spooner, and Lysander Spooner says, "Go, Ron, go."
All right, and just for anyone who doesn't know, your website is walterblock.com, or go to Mises.org and get more information from the great Walter Block. Thank you very much for joining us today, Walter.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
It's our pleasure. Peace, love, and anarchy.
Take care.